Hi, and welcome to Module 4, Session 1. We're going to continue in Module 4, and actually in Module 4 we're going to finish up the Eastern religions. And so we've talked a little bit about Hinduism and how Hinduism had moved started in India from the Vedic religions, and then through the Buddha and through other routes started moving east. And then you have Buddhism and the different strands of Buddhism. And now we're going to be talking about, in this week, first we're going to start with Taoism. It's either spelled sometimes with a T, sometimes with a D, but pronounced Taoism or the way. Then we're going to talk a little bit later in session 2, just a little bit about Confucianism. But for right now, we're going to talk about looking at Taoism or the way, and what Stephen Prothero calls the way of flourishing. And when he's talking about flourishing, he's talking about human beings flourishing and people flourishing in their current lives, not necessarily an afterlife or a salvation or a heaven, but flourishing in this particular life. And so what we have on the screen here, you may have be familiar with the image on the left, the yin yang, but on the right, what you have is the traditionally known founder of Taoism, Lao Tzu, who he is credited with writing the Tao Te Ching. And so we'll talk a little bit about that later on in this particular session. But what you have on the left is you have the yin yang, and this is really the symbol of Taoism, as far as you have things that appear at odds with one another, but instead of being contradictory, they're actually complementary. And so this image, it's a wonderful poetic image, because you have the black and the white molding into one another. While they look at opposites, they're kind of folding into one another. And that's really at the heart of Taoism, is that you don't have these straight up contradictions. Instead, you have this flow, and you have this flow of following the way and following the Tao, and we'll talk a little bit about that in the next screen. So we'll come back to this idea at the very end of this short presentation. So, but moving on. So just some information and influence of Taoism. So it's really interesting to note, was like when you look at the number of Taoists in the world, it can range anywhere between 12 to 175 million. So that's quite inaccurate if you really think about it. But there's a reason. There's a reason for that large variation. One of the reasons is because Taoism in China gets mixed in with all the other Chinese folk religions, and so it's not, while you might have 12 million having some formal affiliation with Taoism, you have up to 100 in China alone, 100 million individuals who might be partaking in some of the Taoist rituals, or the pilgrimages, or have offerings to some, I guess you could say, like the heroes or the immortals that have come before. And so you have a lot of people that might be practicing Taoist rituals that are not officially affiliated with the Taoist religion. So if you called them up and asked them on a survey, it's like, with which religion are you affiliated? They might not answer Taoism. They might answer Buddhism. They might answer Confucianism. They might answer something else entirely. But they would actually still be engaged with, through this mix of these Chinese folk religions or popular religions in China, be engaging in some Taoist rituals, or having some Taoist principles, or some understanding of the way things are, as influenced by Taoism. So it's really interesting, but it's important to note also, and this takes us back to the very beginning of this semester, when we're looking at this difference between religious affiliation and religious identity. And so people can be religious in multiple ways. One of these ways that people can be religious is through what is called belonging. And so they would belong to a particular religious community. So a survey, Pew is one of the surveys that calls people up, or Gallup will call you up and ask you, okay, to which religion do you belong? Say, okay, I affiliate with I'm a Methodist, or I'm a Sunni Muslim, or or I'm a Theravada Buddhist. And so you would actually, in that survey, you would actually affiliate with that particular religious tradition. Well, what you find now, especially when you look at this larger number, many of you mentioned you're surprised at the number of unaffiliated individuals. Well, this does not mean that the people that they don't pray. So they could be not affiliated with any one religious tradition, but they could still believe in God or a higher power. They still could go to church. They still could pray. They still could do many of these religious things. However, they just don't affiliate with any one particular religious tradition. So when you see the numbers of the unaffiliated, the religiously unaffiliated increasing, we're up to about 19-20% now of people in the United States do not affiliate with any one particular religion. This does not mean that they are not religious. So the unaffiliated and atheists, those are not equal. It just means that they do not affiliate with any one particular religious tradition. So I just wanted to make sure that we note that, and this is looking at this discrepancy here, this 12 to 175 million, really illustrates that point, and the strength of the idea of belonging, and for an individual to say, yes, I belong to that particular religion, it is an act on their part. They are self-identifying with that particular religious tradition. So you'll find, and we see this in Taoism, this large discrepancy. 12 million might identify, but if you look at larger numbers, 175 million across the world might actually be partaking in some of these Taoist rituals. So, okay, so keep that in mind. Not just with this religion, but with other religions as well. So Lao Tzu and the Tao Te Ching. Next to the Bible, this is actually the most translated text into different languages. It is relatively short, and one of the reasons why people argue that it's translated and it's so highly read is because it is short, and it's very metaphorical and very poetic. And so if you're going into that text and looking for something, you could actually find what it is that you're looking for in that particular text. So but you can also see especially over the past 40, 50 years, I'll circle back to this at the very end. I'm looking at the Western influence, and this actually, the book of the Tao of Pooh and the Day of Piglet, these two texts, and I had you read just a short little selection of the Tao of Pooh. These really introduced the West to the concepts of Taoism, along with the Beat Generation, the and some other things that we'll talk about later on, of introducing Taoism to the West. So, but moving on. So what is the Tao? Or again, it can be spelled with a T or with a D. So it's really hard to even looking at the Taoist literature, hard to tease out what is the Tao. We can say what it is not. It is not this personal divinity that you might find, especially in Christianity. This very personal, one-on-one. I have someone. If a Southern evangelical will say, "I have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ," that is not necessarily what you would find here in Taoism. So now the Tao is called the Way, and this is the way that we are supposed to be living our lives. And so, Taoism argues that we are born natural, and that the structures of society are actually holding us back, and so we bend our lives to be constrained by these social structures, and we end up kind of doing a disservice to ourselves and not living the way. And we'll talk a little bit about qi and energy in a bit. Now, okay, when talking about the Tao, this is the Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. So this is the first line from the Tao Te Ching. And so the Tao is ineffable. And what this means, it's unable to be put into words. So oftentimes when you'll have a religious experience, you can say, "Oh, it's ineffable." It's like, I can't. You had to be there. I can't really tell you about it. I can't really put it into words. And that's what the Tao. So the relationship with the individual to the Tao, or following, you experience the Tao. Really is one way to look at it. So it's infinite, the Tao. It's eternal, and so there's no beginning. There's no end. It is unnameable. It kind of relates back to the ineffable. You can't really put a name to it. It's more of a description. And so when you're talking about the Tao, you're talking about it in a way that you understand that you're not fully comprehending, you're not fully discussing the Tao. That words are always going to fall short. The Tao is hidden but always present. And all things are born from it, and all things return to it. And so, and also noting this notion of it's impersonal. It's not a personal. You don't have a personal relationship with the Tao in Taoism. So it's a little bit different, and so it goes back to with Eastern philosophy and how it's a little bit different in the thinking between Eastern philosophy and what we're going to move to with the Western monotheistic religions. And the individual's relationship with the quote unquote the divine. It's not a divine in the same sense that it is a transcendent being, but it is immanent, an immanent being in that it pervades all things. The Tao pervades all things, but it's not this separate entity apart from the world. Instead, it permeates and pervades all things. All things are born from it, and all things return to it. Okay. And so I'm going to quickly just talk a little bit about the teachings. I don't want to cover too much of what was covered in the Prothero text and the other short videos and the selections. So I'll just touch on some of these important teachings. But it's been fluid over time with various influences. And so now what you find in China, and what is now China, but going back through history, is you have what are called the three teachings. And the three teachings include Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism. And so on the surface, and we'll see this in the next session when we're talking about Confucianism. So on the surface, Taoism and Confucianism seem quite conflicting, but they're not conflicting in the Chinese mind. Instead, they're seen to be almost complementary to one another, where you have these rigid structures and formal relationships, or what are called Li, L-I, in Confucianism, where you have this fluid, free-flowing, embracing energy, wandering spirit of Taoism. So on the surface, they might appear that they conflict with one another, but the argument here, the argument that Prothero makes, and even that Novak makes in the selections, is that they actually might be able to be seen as complementary. And so this is where you run into this issue that you can study the philosophical or the theological, the religious teachings of a particular religion. But what you really have to look at is you have to look at how religion works, quote unquote, on the ground. And so if you look at the two systems side by side, it's like these don't make any sense whatsoever. How could these two systems function well in a society where people subscribe to both and partake in both? How could these two systems, it seems contradictory, but we have a human capacity for syncretism. We have a human capacity for sort of dealing with internal contradictions, and so we're able to do that. And so that's what you might find here in China, and the history of this relationship between Taoism and Confucianism, starting back before probably around 200 or so before Common Era. Pretty much is how far back it gets traced. But Stephen Prothero calls the teachings a grab bag of philosophical observations, moral guidelines, body exercises, medicinal theories, supernatural stories, and longevity techniques. This really is what comprises the teachings of Taoism. Now we can point to, okay, really, what are the highest values, or what are like the crucial, almost salient, the most salient piece, or the most important piece, really the highest value in Taoism is life and nurturing life. And so life is really is what the Tao creates and permeates. It permeates life, and so it's our responsibility to continue to nurture that life, and not just human life, but animal life as well. And so, how do you go about doing that? Well, you go about doing that by living life to the fullest beyond the convention. And in some strands of Taoism, it can even lead to immortality for some individuals. But on the flip side of that, you don't really have an afterlife, and so immortality is immortality in this space on this earth. Taoism doesn't really surmise about an afterlife. It's not an interest. And so if we want to ask the question, does Lao Tzu go to heaven? It's like, well, the answer, like, well, that's not really an interest. Instead, it's talking about, through these practices, you can actually achieve immortality, and longevity of life, because that's really the highest value. And so it's not just focusing on an afterlife. So it's not immortal in that sense, but instead it's an afterlife in embracing this key, this vital energy, that again, that sort of permeates, that is part of this life, and permeates all these little things with the Tao. So you can look at sort of like this, and this is as we're moving forward, and you can see in the text, so Taoism starts to break off into different sects, and starts to, just like with any religious tradition, is you're going to have, any long-standing religious tradition anyways, you're going to have break-off groups. You're going to have it again, these are lived religions. These are religions that are functioning on the ground. And so they might take divergent paths at particular historical markers. So, but you can talk about like popular Taoism. And this is where, going back to the very beginning and talking about this relationship between 12 million people versus 175 million. So they go, well, how many people practice Taoism? But they're probably practicing this popular Taoism, that mixes with Confucianism or Buddhism and other rituals and practices. They can be celebrating birthdays of deities, or going on pilgrimages, or doing other things that are partaking, that are Taoist rituals by their nature, but the individual might not say, "Oh, I am practicing Taoist." And so, but you have a larger split as well, between philosophical Taoism and more religious Taoism. And so, starting at the bottom of these lists, like the philosophical ones are more for the elites in society. These are for people who actually, the monks who actually go and live in monasteries, and isolate themselves. And the religious Taoists kind of see the philosophical Taoists as being somewhat selfish, because they're focused on their own connection and their own living out the way, and not really interested in others. It's an individual enterprise for them. And so they're focused, and that gets, sorry, I don't have that on the slide, but yeah, so they're focused on themselves, and trying to achieve and becoming one with the Tao. And so they harnessing the energy. And so another aspect of this philosophical, using its own quote unquote scriptures. And so really it's not really borrowing from the other of the three teachings that is prevalent in China, or the region, what is currently China. So that particular region in the East. And in the philosophical, it's like it's a more stoic approach, in that you accept death, and you accept the changing nature of all things. And there's a little bit of a Buddhist influence there, in accepting the changing nature of all things and understanding that they're changing. And so at this point, for the philosophical Taoists, you accept death and understand death as part of this, everything kind of flowing out of the Tao and everything returning back to the Tao. So, but with religious Taoism, you can go through these practices and embrace this energy and actually try to achieve immortality. Again, it's not immortality in the sense of an afterlife, but it's actually a immortality in this life. So there have been individuals that are revered. For example, Lao Tzu is understood to be immortal. and that he didn't die. He just wandered into the desert and was never to be seen again. So as far as like this religious Taoism, the religious Taoism borrows from Confucianism and Buddhism, and you have a range of spiritual techniques that include sexual techniques. They include a wide variety of techniques in order to trying to become one with the Tao and being part of this flow. And this is something that ordinary people can partake in. So if you're looking at it, it's like, okay, well, some of these ideas sound familiar. Where have I come across this before? If you look at Feng Shui, this is a practice. You can go out to Ph.D TV has a Feng Shui your bedroom, and if you can click on that, I'm not sure if you can click on that link there. I think you can see it. But what not to do. And so if you're wondering how to go ahead and design your bedroom, it has a whole list of things of what not to do. Because what it does, the idea is that when you set things up in a certain pattern, there's an energy flow that goes through it. And so, for example, if you put your bed, the headboard of your bed, up against a wall that is sharing a wall with a bathroom, that it interrupts that flow of energy throughout the room, and you can't tap into that energy. And so you become out of order. You become out of sync with this energy with the Tao that is flowing through. So the Tao flows through. There's the Prothera text talks about it, with the three types of energies. And so Feng Shui really tries to harness that particular energy and allow it to flow in its most productive manner. Looking at the Beatles and the Beat Generation. The Beat Generation, I talked a little bit about them with Buddhism, but they had a mix. They had a Buddhist, even the Dharma Bums, the book by Jack Kerouac, it's a mix of Buddhist and Taoist techniques and Buddhist and Taoist ideas and principles in living, especially the wandering part. That's quite Taoist, or like this philosophical Taoism of becoming a wanderer and trying to become one with the Tao, not really having family responsibility and that sort. If you're looking at the Beatles actually had a song called "The Inner Light," which is George Harrison wrote, which is actually part of I think it's chapter 47 of the Tao Te Ching, and so you can click on that and listen to that. It's I think it's the B-side from Eleanor Rigby. And Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. So some of the movies actually, if you're talking about if you can fully embrace this energy, some of the ideas is that you can in addition to becoming immortal, you can fly. And so like with the Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, the idea of being able to harness that energy and becoming one with the Tao, that you are able to then fly around and do battle that way. So, and then also Qigong. So this is where you have this practice. You might have seen this when I lived in Palo Alto in California before moving back to DC, and we would see this just walking through the park in the morning. We would see, and Tai Chi is a variant of this as well. But it's about energy flow, and it's about allowing that energy to flow through you, and that is part of this energy of the Tao. So that's just a little overview of Taoism. We will set it up as looking at Taoism in contrast to Confucianism, and that's actually a question that you have for the discussion board. Is which, if you're looking at these two systems and you had to pick one, which one would you choose, and why would you choose it? So think about that. But again, with what you have in Taoism, you have much more of a free-flowing. You don't have a set creed. You don't necessarily have a set canon. It's kind of as Stephen Prothero knows, you have like this grab bag of ideas, but all related back to this ineffable, unnameable, yet eternal and infinite Tao, that all things flow out of the Tao and all things return to the Tao. So with that, thank you very much, and I hope you have a nice day.